if I could just provide a bit of background on an area that we've been working on within community. And that involves the idea of our community having the capacity to manage our reserve lands. Currently, our reserve lands are managed through the Indian Act, more specifically about 32 sections within the Indian Act. And you might recall that we had a land surrender involving the Highway Development Project. A central player in all of that was Indian Affairs, people like Judy Crosman and others that helped with that process. And then after that, we had a land designation vote for a certain portion of the lands where currently Bayside Travel Center is going to be constructed and hopefully operating roughly in August. So, and through that process, Indian Affairs or Indigenous Services Canada played a central role because they're responsible for the management of reserve lands within all of the communities throughout Canada. But back in 1996, I think it was, a number of communities were wanting to develop their lands, and they had issues with respect to how the department was operating. At times, there are many bands who have many requests, and basically you have to wait in line in order for them to sort of deal with your issues. And when you're talking about the commercial development of lands, economic development, at times, time is of the essence because people want to move at the speed of business. And so what that spoke to was a number of bands wanting to assume control over the management of their own reserve lands. And they have done that through this act. It's a federal act, and it's called the First Nations Lands Management Act. And a number of bands have applied and fall under that act, and Paqtnkek is one of them. And we are in this process of assuming more control over the management of our own lands, not only for highway development and commercial development, but we're keen on developing that capacity within our community to develop our lands and to manage our lands rather than relying upon the federal government. So how that takes place, it's quite a bit of a process, but there are two things that are really important. One of them is a land code. And basically what a land code is, it's the band sort of process on how we would propose to manage our own reserve lands. It will speak to how lands would be administered through the band office, and further to that, further to the land code is what they call an individual agreement. And that involves, the lands are outlined within that agreement. There are certain funding issues that would take place because as we assume, if we assume control and management over our reserve lands, then we would be entitled to funding for capacity and support from the federal government, more specifically Indigenous Services Canada. So that process is taking place. That is the development of a land code, the development of an individual agreement, but it doesn't happen automatically. What happens in order to get this approved is community, both on and off reserve, our on and off reserve members will vote on whether or not you will want us to manage these lands through the land code. So you have a say, you have a voice on whether or not you think this should happen. And so this session is part of an information session on what that whole thing is about. And I'm really happy we have a number of resource people here to answer any questions you might have regarding this whole process. And there are a number of panels out there. You might see information that you have. I know Richard has been quite proactive in getting information out there. And certainly this isn't the last time we're going to be talking about this in the community. We'll have more sessions. And again, it's all pointed towards whether or not you, membership, would agree for us to manage our own lands through a land code. And other bands have done it, a number of other bands. More recently, Member 2 has voted to, they have voted, right? They haven't? Okay, they're slated for June for their vote, but Conn River has out in Newfoundland and Madawaska as well. So a number of bands have voted and agreed to manage their own lands through a land code, through a successful vote. So I just wanted to provide this by way of background. I'll look to Paula, who is administering this project on behalf of the band, to provide you with some further comments and details, and then we'll get Rose to present, and then Danielle, okay? And obviously, after, when people present, we'll entertain any questions that you will have on this whole process. So, Paula?
The Indian Act has so much control over our lives. And when it comes to land, the one thing we truly, truly need to protect is something that the band look forward to signing on. So I got hired on. I go through a series of tasks and milestones to reach, but in the end, we'll come up with a community law and we vote on it. Things like, if we want certain areas protected, then we want to make sure that's in the law. If we want to make sure ag dev is in one spot and we have residential in another, it's like land use planning as well in that section. So over the last 7 months or so, I've been going to different training and working on different things, working with LabRC, the Land Advisory Board, working with Indigenous Services Canada, kind of taking a whole team approach to how we can become stewards of our own land. So one of the handouts we passed is a copy of each of these slides. So basically it gives a background, like how does the land code work, what's our benefits, and some myths, because there's some crazy ones out there. And also a map of signatory communities that are there. Also, the other handout was just a plain language guide, because they have a lot of legalese and government talk in the framework agreement. Even I was looking up words, I had no clue what they were. So breaking it out into plain language so that we have everything we need to do. And one thing I do want to bring up, especially when it comes to our lands, is this has nothing to do with Aboriginal right and title. We do not lose our rights. We do not lose title. This aids us in better stewarding those options that we have.
So I've been on the land code the land code planning, I guess, for the last 4 years. And I had the honor and pleasure of sitting with some very respectable leaders across the country, Canada, one being Chief Robert Louis, who's been spearheading the land code management or the framework agreement, and how the challenges that they're having on the West Coast when it comes to developing on their lands and not having control ownership of their lands. So He just kind of sent me down a little cheat sheet. I mean, like, we do have like our executive meetings. We just had one a couple weeks ago where we had to pass some really huge resolutions down as in terms of lands to legislation, and how those changes in legislation is going to have great impact and positive impacts on lands in First Nation communities. So just for my role, I mean, I've been facilitating this with Chief and Council. Chief and Council have been involved in a lot of engagement sessions with the Labor Land Advisory Board, and Miko Nicholas has been coming down and doing a lot of one-on-one work with our Chief and Council. So they have been very proactive in this movement that we are now here, in a position where we're going to be developing our codes. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the land code and the possibility it creates. It's a comprehensive law created by First Nations that replaces 32 sections of the Indian Act that relate to land management. And when members of a First Nation vote yes to a land code, the Government of Canada no longer has to say in how the community's reserved lands are managed. Specifically, First Nations exercise powers without supervision or approval from enact, or from ISK, as what they're called today. The First Nation holds and manages revenue for their lands instead of it all being held in trust by the Crown. So having our own land code or our land trusts, they're not held at Indian Affairs no more. The band will be holding those trusts in our own community. With a land code in place, Canada continues to hold title to reserve land for First Nations use and benefits, so we still cannot sell or transfer title. And there's more than 80 First Nations as of the last meeting that we went to, or I streamlined in, that have already started implementing their land codes. So one thing that we had Paula doing is actually going to these sessions and sitting down with the communities that are already gone through the process. They have a lot of best practices that we can share, that we don't make those mistakes or things we might miss. We're catching those things early now as we're going through working with the community and developing our land codes. As the Chief mentioned, we have a land code that's an individual transfer agreement between First Nation and Canada. So Paula right now has like a working group that includes Canada, or ISK. We have our Surveyor General, we have our Resource Center with us, and our Chief and Council, and myself that sit on this working committee that supports Paula. This agreement identifies what land the land code will apply to, and when the transfer of responsibility for land management takes place, how much will the community actually have for funding for implementing the code. First Nations must vote in favor of the land code and the individual agreement before the land code takes effect. So from today on, the clock started ticking, when we signed on as signatories to the FNLMA on December 16th of 2017. So during that time, we've been screening and preparing our community to get us to this point now where we'll be exercising our area of jurisdiction. Some of the things of the land code, of course, will involve a lot of work from off and on reserve individuals to be part of this land code process. Paula will be looking at developing a committee, like a land code committee. Right now, she has on the interim a higher committee that works with her on the day-to-day operations of supporting her in her role as the land code coordinator. The framework agreement outlines a procedure on how the ratification process will happen here in Paqtnkek. We're no strangers to the ratification process. We've gone through 2 of them, or 3 of them, I understand, with our matrimonial real property as well. We went through the land surrender and the land designation. So it's very important that when we develop our land code, there's transparency in the land code. So we will have to have like annual reports to the members in our community on the land management activities by Chief and Council. That is a mandatory, mandatory action item that needs to be taken, as it is not in the Indian Act, it's under the manager, Chief and Council. This is the same process we would have taken if we were accountable to the minister. Each of our land codes must include rules on financial accountability for management of lands, resource, and revenues. So if we're going to be utilizing land for economic development, we have to be transparent on how that land is being utilized for the best benefit for the community members or for Paqtnkek. First Nation leadership is legally required to follow the laws they enact in the land codes. So when the laws are applied or outlined in a land code, it is leadership that have to follow these processes and these rules. It helps build to identify and prevent conflicts of interest, and there are clear procedures on how amending the land code could take place. So just for us, like the exercise our community has undertaken was a massive one. So some of the benefits of having a land code come down to 4 related areas that I wanted to kind of talk about, because this is a movement of self-government as we move into our land code, creating a greater potential for economic development, gaining more control, and having the same weight as the Indian Act in court. So for Land Code for Economic Development, it removes their administration hurdles that the Indian Act opposes and allows for new rules and procedures on revenues from natural resources and how land and money generated from the land are managed. With the power to make the decisions, the First Nation can create more favorable conditions for business, deal directly with companies, industry, and municipalities to improve communications, time management, making processes move faster and more effectively. So just as an example, now what we went through at Bayside, we had to go through the surrender for the interchange, the roads, and we had to then the community had to designate the land so we can make economic development happen on that property. For the future, if any future EDO or whoever the chief and council decide for go of business, they don't have to go through all that process again, but they would still have to follow the land code rules we outline in our community. Where we want to designate those areas for economic development, won't have to include another designation vote. It just makes the turnover happen a lot quicker for any business negotiations that we have to enter. The control that we have of the land codes is to the First Nation is that we can exercise our powers, rights, and privileges of the owner in relation to our land. These can enter contracts and to borrow, expend, and invest money, be party to legal proceedings regarding the land, and regulate and control of prohibit land use and development, including zoning and subdivision control. And land transactions can happen faster and quicker without Canada being our intermediary, as before we would have to go through order of council, then we would have to go through justice, and would have to go through all of those processes would be eliminated for us. Also, the importance of zoning is that, say Kara come in and she's Irvin, and then she decides, I'm just going to put my development on that land because I think it's the most feasible. Nobody can come in and use the land that way without following the right permitting processes that will take place here in Paqtnkek as we exercise our lands. Another great thing about us getting into the land code is that it's equal weight as the Indian Act. The land code, once enacted, holds the same authority as the Indian Act in court. The land code is approved by the members of the First Nation as it applies to. It is not approved by the minister. So I guess for the drawbacks of this, now that we're in this process, there is no turning back to the Indian Act as a land management system once the land code is enacted. The adjustment phase can be challenging. It is change, but the self-regulation empowerment that comes from taking back control of our lands will be worth it. And I hope that kind of helps summarize some of the thinking as you guys go through asking us questions in the panels. That's it. Thank you.
I guess I just really want to start with that this is a community-led initiative. It's not a Canada-led initiative, so it's community-based, it's community-driven, based on community engagement, community involvement. The community is who chief and council will answer to now as opposed to the minister. You know, protection of our lands. Who better knows what goes on our lands than us? You know what I mean? Not somebody sitting in a desk or cubicle in a local regional office that has no idea that the neighbor's dumping. You know what I mean? Like, we know what happens on the ground. And who better to manage that? Geez, I'm really nervous, sorry. Okay, some other highlights that I was sitting there thinking about. So environmental protection, the lands aren't able to be expropriated anymore by provincial or municipal governments. And the federal government can only expropriate in extreme, like, national emergency circumstances. So no longer can Nova Scotia come and say, well, we're going to expropriate that land for the highway, for the twinning of the highway. You know, they would have to deal directly with Paqtnkek to come to an agreement that was beneficial for Paqtnkek as well. What else? It's relatively new in the Atlantic, like I had said. I'm a technician with the First Nation Land Management Resource Center. I've been on for a year now. The land code is kind of relatively new in the east. If you can look at the signatory communities, there's a big concentration in BC, the prairies, Ontario. It's relatively new here. Like I said, we have 3 developmental communities and 2 operational. So member 2, yourself, and my community Woodstock are in the developmental process. So it's kind of picking up steam on the East Coast here. Geez, what else can I say? I want to stress too that the land code doesn't pass unless the community decides that it passes. Right? This is a community decision. So your input and involvement is very important in this process. Geez, what else did they cover? I think they covered pretty much everything. I can tell you about the numbers. So across Canada, we have 82 operational First Nations. That means that they're operating under their own land codes. Actually, I take that back. We have 79 operational. 3 have moved on to broader self-government or treaty agreements, but they started with the land code process. And we have 69 developmental communities across Canada. What else? Geez. Do you guys have any questions? I'm just trying to think of other things that they haven't covered. No, I work for the First Nation Land Management Resource Center, so there's the Lands Advisory Board, and then they're kind of like the government relations aspect, and we're the technical body, so we work with the communities to help them develop their land codes or assist them in any way we can.
I mean, Matt, what you mentioned is title, and this common law, case law concept called Aboriginal title, and it's been subject to litigation across the country, internationally, and certainly within Nova Scotia. And there has been an Aboriginal title case that has went forward on behalf of the Mi'kmaq in Nova Scotia, and at least for present, we weren't successful in that case. So it's still an outstanding issue that the Mi'kmaq are pushing government to negotiate on essentially what Aboriginal title is and to have resolution of that. But for present purposes, it's the position of the provincial government. This is their position, right? It doesn't mean we have to accept it, that they own all the mineral rights in the province. So I know other bands have been dealing with that under the land code regime. I mean, I know, other bands have. So these are things that, like what was said earlier, that the interest of the land doesn't change. You know, it's just more or less the management in terms of who manages the lands with respect to the land code. Mm-hmm. Okay. Sorry.
No, that was great. I thought it was just, yeah, so the land code will not affect Aboriginal treaty rights. So thank you for, I was just thinking in the reserve boundary context, but yeah, Aboriginal treaty rights are, not a part of this. That's something separate, and it's not affected.
So essentially, going forward, we'll be conducting more focus groups, cafes, and what of the like, so that we have the community involved, because I'm one, I don't want to push without the community behind us. And we have, how it's working now is we do a community ratification process, is basically how we're going to vote when, you know, how many days we're going to mail out things to off-reserve band members and whatnot. Then we work on an individual agreement with Canada, so basically how our relationship between the two of us is going to work. Then we move into creating the actual laws and bringing that to the community, saying, you know, like, we want a law that's set where, for example, we want a buffer zone on the river. We want, you know, 200 feet on each side. Well, if we wanted that in the land code and into our laws, then we need to enact that and have that in place. Once individual agreements done, ratification process, the land is okay, like the land code is okayed by the community, we have a vote. Then we sign the agreement. If vote is successful, we sign the agreement with Canada, and we keep on cruising and taking care of what we need to take care of, which is the land. If you type in, if you went to Google, everybody loves Dr. Google and Professor Google, you go on, I know LabRC, so labrc.com has a beautiful, I'll say, a library of information on anything you want to know about land codes, anything in there, all the signatories, how they did it, copies of land codes, copies of communication, anything under the sun is pretty much on that website. And if you have any questions, Rose or myself, or I can forward along. If I don't know, I'll find you the answer.
Want to just talk about the website maybe coming soon?
Also, one of the things that we have on our tally sheet of things to do is we're going to create our own website, so it'll be something along the lines of paqtnkeklandcode.ca or a lot of the like. And we will have everything posted on there, any updates, any samples, where we are in the stages of the land code. Anything to do with lands will be on that website. So that'll be coming soon. If we were to acquire more land, say for example in the land description for now, or like now, we would say the land's legally owned by Paqtnkek under with its name, and we buy, I don't know, 20,000 acres outside of Antigonish. Once that goes, we can have it worded in the land code where it says any land acquired that has gone through the additions to reserve process is therefore under the jurisdiction of this land code. So there's still an additions to reserve process with the government, but it's a much speedier process.
So your land base can only grow. It can never diminish. So as you add lands through the addition to reserve process, because it's a policy, it falls outside the land management provisions of the Indian Act. Where it's a policy, it still applies. But yes, your reserve size can never diminish. It can only grow. So any addition to reserve lands will be added to the land code if that's how they choose to proceed. So, and the amendment number 6 deals with this as well. So it's hoping to speed up the addition to reserve process. So as Rose had alluded to, there's like the delegation of responsibility is lowered. So instead of going to the Privy Council, I think it would lie with the RDG or the Minister? RDG. Sorry, yeah, the Minister. So it takes it down, it keeps it local as opposed to going up and sitting for 6-8 months at Privy Council waiting for them to decide. So I know the delegation of responsibility is lowered. I think the third-party interest, dealing with third-party interests, it's a faster process. So right now, under the addition to reserve process, any third party that's on the land needs to be dealt with prior to adding it. So Nova Scotia Power or Emera, is it? Any kind of third parties like that need to be settled prior to the lands being added. So I think that there's some leeway there with the third party discussions. I can post that on the the website, though. I can post the different the amendment number 6, or Paula can have it posted.
Yeah, some of the things, the benefits that Paqtnkek would have on, land code. The first one, Paqtnkek, not the Crown, makes decisions over land and resources. There's a lot of issues happening in Nova Scotia. We live in a small land-based Nova Scotia, and we compete over land, resources, and all the things that I guess the country wants to make money with. And I have a real concern about our land and how it's going to be impacted by industry that happens all around us, whether it's farming, mining, all of those things. And we have to protect our land, and taking over, I guess, jurisdiction over our land is a major first step in protecting our land and determining what's going to happen on our land and basically around our land. Because some of the things we have to worry about is say, species at risk. One of the things we don't know is if we find something that's very rare on our property, we can't use that land for anything else. It's got to be protected. So we lose that piece of property. And so we have to find a way of mediating that problem. We have to protect things, but yet we have to rely on our small land base to develop and to grow. And we have to take jurisdiction over and have a way of determining how we're going to solve that problem. Also, the resources under our land, we may not, if we don't have our own jurisdiction over land, we may not have total rights to it. I don't know what the laws are on resources that are found on reservation land. And but if we had total jurisdiction, I think we would have more rights to that resource ourselves. Like the forest, mining, and things like that. The legal right to hold and buy property. You can't own property on reserve. You can get a fee simple ownership of it, but you can't buy it, sell it, or anything like that. Once we start buying lands off reserve and extending our property lines, you can own land. You can buy it. It's collateral. You could sell it within the band, wherever, and it creates an economy within the land property itself. And just like expropriation, like she was saying, government can come in, expropriate our land right now because it's owned by the government. And but if we have jurisdiction over land, we'll have control over what can come into our lands. And the most extreme thing you've seen in the United States is the pipeline going through the Standing Rock Reservation. And their land got expropriated. They put up a big battle, but if you don't have jurisdiction over your land, you don't have nothing. You don't have anything to fight government when they want to expropriate your land. They may find something that they want to get after and make money from, and if you don't have jurisdiction over it, then you have little tools to fight or create or gain in benefits what they may want to do. And I guess the business things, we'd be able to do business much faster. We'd have a faster turnover in deciding what we're going to do with land and how to develop it. Depending on Indian Act and the government, it takes a long time. Even just turning land from fee simple, non-native land that we bought and turning it into the reservation takes quite a process. And I guess the biggest thing we talked about today was environmental protection. We talked about climate change. We talked about all the things that potentially happen on our lands. And right now we have to take some kind of control over how we use our land. Like, we can't allow people to build in floodplains, or we can't put our businesses there because they're going to flood maybe once a year, maybe once every 10 years, maybe once every 20 years, maybe once in 50 years, and it can destroy homes and infrastructure that we built. And if we don't plan, we will lose a lot of money in losing that kind of infrastructure. Also with, just the things that are happening, we're going to have to buy land to protect ourselves from the inevitable sea level rise, and as water levels get higher and we get more storms, we're going to lose use of land here and there, and we're going to have to gain more property to move things and infrastructure and build residential areas in the future. So it's quite a process, and I think it's something that we're going to really have to depend on in the future. Thank you.